The presentation is about using measurement to translate business vision into operational software strategies. It's the basic idea of what do you really need to be able to do to build a reasonable measurement program within an organization. And so I'm going to start off with some basics to motivate measurement and give you some basic concepts that I'm going to make use of. And then we'll talk about goal-oriented measurement, most specifically a look at the goal question metric paradigm. And then we're going to expand on that paradigm to look at to look at the concept of trying to tie business goals back into the measurement goals. And in that, we're going to use a mechanism called this GQM plus strategies. And then finally, I'm going to end up with some guidelines about a measurement program, about the organizational structure, and maybe some hints about where to start and what you should do in the beginning. So, my first slide is about measurement and motivation and basics. But for the motivation, there are numerous quotes I could have picked, but I picked three here because I thought they were important and interesting. One is from Galileo, who says, "What is not measurable, make measurable." And the issue in that situation is sometimes it's hard to make things measurable, but it's worth working at it and trying to make them so they can be measured. And Pasteur said a science is as mature as its measurement tools. And there again is the argument that if we don't have good measurement, we're not very sophisticated and mature in terms of what we're doing. And last but not least, I picked Peter Drucker's, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Because it's about the business and how do we run it, and if we don't have data and we don't have information that's important to us, then we can't manage what we're doing. So why do organizations measure? And I listed three main themes here. One is sort of to create visibility so they can understand the business. What kind of baselines do they have? What are the relationships between variables? What are the critical factors that cause problems or cause successes? They want to manage and control projects based on quantitative evidence. So how do you plan and estimate? How do you track actuals versus estimates? How do you go through the decision-making process? How do you use the data to help decide what you should do next? And last, to guide improvement and sort of optimize the individual activities. So how do you prioritize? How do you assess whether or not you're achieving what you're doing? How do you move along and be able to tailor and modify technologies to be more effective? And how do you package them so they become part of your intellectual property in terms of how the business operates? But that little line on the bottom is an important one. It says the measurement is a means to an end, not an end in itself. And I'm going to repeat this theme a little bit throughout this process, because many organizations measure, but that's sort of their end. They measure, and then it's a question of how they analyze and how they make use of that data that becomes an important part of the process. So some example questions that someone might ask is how much will a project cost, and where am I spending my money? So it's important to build a corporate memory, baselines of current practices, so you have a visible history of what you've been doing. What should happen? Is it happening? To plan, track, control project development and evolution. Are certain types of problems commonplace? Is an organization repeating certain kinds of things that you need to know what they are so you can determine the strengths and weaknesses, for example, of your current processes? What techniques will minimize the problems, change the baselines? Develop a rationale for adopting and refining new techniques. When do you need to change the way you're doing business? And when do you need to just evolve what you're doing into something a little more sophisticated? What is the reliability of the product after delivery? How do you evaluate the quality of the process that created that product as well as the product? And are we making progress in increasing market share? How does an organization decide whether it's achieving its goals in terms of what does it want to do and where does it want to be? So those are the kinds of things we'd like to be able to address and make part of our measurement organization. Just a quick view. What is measurement? It's an attempt at quantifying entities, and the entity could be a process, a product, could be resources. there are attributes of those entities like effort or size or experience, and then there are rules about how we would count something and what the number or symbol might be. So it made everything be in terms of effort. We can talk in terms of person days. In terms of size, we can talk about lines of code. In terms of experience, we can talk about a subjective measure of a lot versus a little. So we have all different ways in which we can start to address these issues. The key here is to try and quantify in some rational way whatever it is we're looking at. So, examples of measurement data. The point of this slide is that there's an enormous amount of data available to us. Resource data in terms of effort and calendar time, change and defect data in terms of what kinds of changes, what kinds of defects do we have. Process data, maybe it's a little less common. The idea of what's your process definition, and are people doing the process you thought they were supposed to be doing? How do you measure conformance so that you know what activity is really occurring? And domain understanding. In our business, we do a process on some application. How well do we understand that application domain or the specific requirement that we're dealing with? Those are things that need to be measured. Then, of course, product data. That's probably the most common in many cases. Product characteristics, whether they be logical or whether they be physical. And even use and context information. I want to say a little bit about the kinds of measures because I want to make it clear that it's really important to try and find some mechanism to make entities measurable. So there are objective measures, which is sort of some absolute measure taken on a product or process, and it's usually done on an interval or ratio scale, and I'll talk about that, the different scales in the next slide. But things like anything I can count, whether it's the number of lines of code or the time to development or the number of errors or changes, those are objective things, and if two people went in and did them, they do them exactly the same. Subjective measures, on the other hand, are some estimate of extent or degree in the application of some technique or a classification or qualification of a problem. And these are usually done on the nominal and ordinal scale. That is, it's one of these versus one of those. So the quality of use of a method or technique, for example, you did it very well or you didn't do it well at all. We're going to try and be more specific than that. The experience of a programmer. I could throw in something like number of years, but it might be something a little more subjective than that. So let me come to this next slide about the measurement scales. And many of you may know this is nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. And so nominal just says it's about determination of a quality. It's a type of defect. It's a defect of omission or it's a defect of commission. So it's not better or worse, they're just different. Ordinal scale says that the determination of greater than or less than. So, for example, the level of training in an application. I can say you've had a lot of training, you've had no training, you've had a middle amount of training. And therefore I could say someone who's had a lot of training with a course and has applied it knows more about that particular application or that process than someone who hasn't even read the book. Then there's interval, and that's mostly about just the quality of intervals of differences. So things like schedule. It's March 1 to March 15th. Okay, it's April 6th to March 17th. That's over a whole year to go backwards. There's ratio, which is more common, which is just the actual determination of equal ratios. It means that there's a zero. A 0 point is there. So I can really talk about lines of code, number of defects, code complexity in a simple way. Most of the stuff